Good evening, everyone. My name is Bill Burns, and I'm the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I am very pleased and very honored to welcome High Representative Federica Mogherini back to the Carnegie Endowment. Just a few weeks ago, High Representative Mogherini released the European Union's new global strategy, an admirable and ambitious effort to think through how Europe can best navigate a fast-changing international landscape. That wider landscape seems more crowded and more complicated than ever. And the reality is that almost everywhere you look on the geopolitical compass, our European allies are hard-pressed. The deeply unsettling reality of Brexit from the West, terrorism, a massive migration crisis, and now new uncertainties in Turkey from the South, and a resurgent Russia from the East. These pressures pose some very difficult questions about the future of Europe and its role in the world. Our Carnegie Europe Center in Brussels has worked hard to try to help answer them. And today, High Representative Mogherini will lay out how she believes the EU should respond. High Representative Mogherini has taken on this challenge with her characteristic skill, energy, and imagination, traits that proved indispensable to her rapid rise in European politics, and traits that proved equally indispensable to bringing the comprehensive nuclear agreement with Iran across the finish line almost exactly 1 year ago. We could not ask for a more timely or important conversation, and we couldn't be more fortunate to have that conversation with High Representative Mogherini. So with that uncharacteristically short intervention from a recovering diplomat, I hope you'll join me in welcoming High Representative Federica Mogherini. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to address such a high-level audience. As you know, I was particularly eager to introduce our new global strategy here in Washington and here in Carnegie in particular. Carnegie has been involved very, very closely in the preparation of the strategy. We have hosted a number of events and contributed actively to our experts' consultation. And as you know very well, the drafting of this strategy has been a very open process. Of course, our European institutions and our member states have played a crucial role, but the whole process was not simply at government level, and it never happened behind closed doors. This is a strategy for all our European citizens, and it is a strategy that speaks to our partners in the world. You had to be involved, and you will have to be involved in the next stages of this process. So I'm particularly grateful for your comments, and I look forward to our discussion tonight. But I also wanted to discuss this strategy here in the United States, because our transatlantic bond is an essential element, not only of this document, but of our policies and our daily work. Our friendship with the United States will be crucial to turning our vision into action, both in Europe and here in America, and especially when you look at regional and global governance. In fact, the key principles of the strategy match perfectly the work we have been doing together with the US administration over the past few years. I can speak only for the last year and a half, almost 2 years in office. But just 2 days ago, John Kerry was in Brussels. We were commenting together what was happening in Turkey, and I'm sure we will have the occasion to discuss this in the Q&A session, so I will not stop on that particular issue at the moment. But with his presence in Brussels on Monday, we had the Foreign Affairs Council meeting ongoing. He became the first ever Secretary of State of the United States to join our EU Foreign Affairs Council. And this tells you something. So when you look at the global strategy and read about partnership, this is exactly what it means, that we need each other. I know this should be given for granted, but maybe it is not in these days. None of us, neither our European Union nor the United States, could deal with our common challenges alone. And it's a long list of common challenges, unfortunately. No superpower could solve the crisis in Syria or in Libya alone. None of us alone could bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians, or ensure that the nuclear deal with Iran that we concluded just exactly 1 year ago is strictly implemented. None of us alone can counter Daesh and prevent radicalization effectively. And by the way, this is the reason why I'm in this seat today for a very important ministerial meeting of the Global Coalition to Counter Daesh. And the strength of this work is exactly in partnership and cooperation across the Atlantic and further beyond the Atlantic. So we need each other. That's the main message. That is also the core of the strategy. We need each other, Europe and the United States, and we need all global and regional powers to play their role. We need to invest in partnerships. Partnerships means also that we need to invest in the strength of our partners. Sometimes we believe that having a weak interlocutor, a weak partner on the other side of the sea, in some cases of the Mediterranean, in the European case, would have been easier for Europe. I think we've learned the lesson, and we know today that the strength of our neighbors is our own strength. But we also need to invest in new formats for regional and global cooperation and engagement. To think of the International Support Group for Syria. It was only last year, just a few months after the Iran deal, that we managed to gather all the relevant powers around the same table. The United States, Russia, Europe, Saudi Arabia, Iran. And we all know how difficult this process is, but there is simply no other way to bring peace in Syria rather than working together, even if it is very difficult. Actually, through the difficulties we face around that table, we understand better the difficulties we face on the ground. And such possibility for peace would not exist without our deal with Iran and without the close cooperation between Europe and America, which made it possible. John Kerry and I were sitting together in quite an impressive number of different formats. Together, we decided to revitalize the Middle East Quartet. And the report we have come up with just a few weeks ago cannot be underestimated. If you want, we can come back to this in the Q&As. But for the first time ever, the US, the EU, Russia, and the United Nations have agreed on a clear analysis of the situation on the ground, and also, more importantly, on recommendations on the way forward to turn the two-state solution into a reality. And together, we have also agreed to engage more regularly with the key Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the initiator of the Arab Peace Initiative, Egypt, for obvious reasons, and Jordan for its role on the oil basis. So diplomacy these days, and these are only a few examples, diplomacy in these days require a good dose of determination, consistency, and also creativity. You were mentioning that. Maybe being Italian here brings a bit of an added value. But Europe can be a driving force when it comes to that. To a certain extent, resilience, but also creativity. As you all know, we are 28, we have complicated institutions, and our complexity makes it maybe easier for us to understand others' complexity and deal with that. And already negotiating among us at 28 is a good training for negotiating with the others around the world. So in all these formats, the US and Europe are the backbone, essential partners. And beyond that, we have seen how crucial our cooperation is on the global scene. Together last year, we have made the Paris Agreement on climate change possible. Together, always last year, we have steered the negotiations towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And I really look forward to the two summits on migration this coming September at the margins of the UN General Assembly, because never have so many people been on the move in the world. We have perceived the migratory and refugee crisis very much as a European crisis in the past year. Actually, I think it is high time for us to move to a different kind of concept and realize that people are on the move in the world. And we need to face a global phenomenon in a global way with a global partnership. And this is what we can do in September. Together, I think we have the tools, the resources, the strength to govern this phenomenon in a spirit of partnership. And I am glad that President Obama shares the same vision. for globally shared responsibilities, a global framework for cooperation on migrations, and a stronger international protection of refugees. This is the European way, and I see this as the American way as well. You know, I remember very well the night President Obama was elected. You know very well, in Europe we were all quite excited. He got on stage in Chicago and talked about alliances to repair. 8 years on, our alliance could not be in a better shape. And I can only hope that the next president of the United States will share his same commitment to our transatlantic cooperation and friendship. Our partnership and global partnerships are the only way to face our common challenges, but also to seize the opportunities of our times. Many have noted, including here at Carnegie, that the global strategy builds on a much more realistic assessment of our international environment. And you were mentioning this just a moment before. I can quote for you the first sentence of the European Security Strategy of 2003 that started like this, I quote, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free." End of quotation. So we see today that the world has changed dramatically and very quickly. And indeed, this global strategy starts from a very different assessment of our reality. Because the world has changed, our region has changed, but also the European Union has changed. There's more complexity, but there are also more tools that we have in our toolbox in the European Union to face this reality. But if you look at these last weeks, even these last days, this last month, it's quite clear that we're living in challenging times. We've had, in sequence, the British referendum, the attacks in Nice, the situation in also here in America, in Orlando, tensions in the American societies, terrorist attacks in different parts of the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and what is happening in Turkey in these days. I'm sure we'll come back to that in our conversation. And you think of those events and you clearly get a picture of the challenges we are all facing together, not only in Europe, everywhere in the world. But we couldn't simply focus on the threats, and this is an essential part of our strategy. Also because otherwise it wouldn't be a strategy, it would be a long list of problems to face. We also have to focus on what we can do to prevent future crises and to get the opportunities the world offers to us. I've mentioned some of our recent common achievements, from the deal with Iran to COP21, and we believe the world still has a huge potential for economic growth and for human development. We have a duty to make full use of such potential, and this is our responsibility. And we believe in Europe we have the power to do so, obviously together with our global partners and working as a true union, as a European Union that is really a union. In this work, we don't start from scratch, quite the opposite. Our union is already the biggest aid donor, the first trade partner, and the main foreign investor in most countries in the world. I know you don't easily realize that, but that is the truth. And we are increasingly active also as a global security provider, from Colombia, where we are preparing already to support the implementation of the peace deal, to Myanmar or the Philippines, where we are engaged directly in the national reconciliation processes. So two faraway places where European Union is already a very reliable and significant security provider. But too often in Europe, we don't realize how strong we are. And sometimes we need friends outside of Europe to remind us of our strength, of how important it is, and which kind of responsibility we have. And the message that President Obama passed a couple of weeks ago in Warsaw, a couple of weeks before in Hanover, was extremely powerful in Europe. We need sometimes to have our friends reminding us what we have achieved in the last 70 years and what is at stake, not only for the Europeans, but also for our partners in the world. But today, we have to make sure that we use, as Europeans, all the instruments we have in a coherent and synchronized way. And this is a key part, maybe the key part of the strategy. And this will be vital also for its implementation. The strategy sets a vision, but also sets the instruments and the steps to turn the vision into action, with some concrete, very concrete measures to be taken. Then you will need the political will and the consistency to do it, but that's the second chapter of our work. The threats we face have never been so complex. We all know it. Conflicts for the control of land or even for the control of resources have made an unexpected comeback in recent years. But at the same time, and in the very same conflict sometime, we need to cope also with new kinds of wars. For instance, very clearly, an information war. Some call it a propaganda war. Today we know that military might can be necessary, but it's never sufficient alone because of the complexity of the crisis we have in front of us. And everyone noted that resilience is the key word in the strategy. And one of our core ideas is that we won't manage to end or prevent conflicts if societies and states are not resilient enough. And I say societies and states because the resilience of a state alone would never make the states resilient for real. You need societies to be open and resilient, and that is what makes also institutions in the long run resilient. So human development, job creation, institution building, climate action, and the protection of human rights are for us integral part of our security work. Let me go back, for instance, to the anti-Daesh coalition ministerial we had just earlier today. As you know, just one example, I'll make two. In this case, the European Union is not directly engaged in the military action against Daesh, and yet our contribution in Syria and Iraq is key. Why? Because we are working to strengthen the country's institutions, including the security sector, and the inclusiveness of the societies, in particular in Iraq. In Iraq, for instance, we are demining the areas liberated from Daesh to let the people of Iraq go back to their homes and their lives. And all of this, in today's reality, is an integral part, an integral component of our work for security, as much as the military side of it. Another good example is the work we're doing in Africa. No one invests as much as we do on development cooperation, especially in Africa. But we've also finally realized, took us some time, that development is possible only when a country's security is stable. And this is something our African friends know extremely well. It is impossible for a society to thrive under the constant threat of a terrorist attack or militias and criminal gangs replacing the legitimate authorities. So just a couple of weeks ago, I presented a new proposal to use the European Union funds to empower our partners to tackle their own security, strengthen governance and stability. And this is a way of engaging even more effectively in development cooperation. So capacity building and security sector reforms are indispensable steps for us on the path towards sustainable development. And this is the kind of approach the strategy takes. This is the European way to engagement in the world. An effective, hopefully effective, smart mix of soft and hard power. The old idea that Europeans are from Venus doesn't really reflect a changing reality. Actually, it's quite outdated. Our union is already much more than a purely civilian power. The future of our security is one where hard and soft power are much more blended than in the past. And this is why the strategy calls for Europe to seek the full spectrum of defense capabilities. And the only way to do so is through stronger cooperation inside our union. We need to spend enough on defense, we've said it several times, but we also need to spend better on defense. We need a truly European defense industry, and we need to meet our collective commitment to invest 35% of our total equipment spending in collaborative procurement. This is a way of spending better. We need to strengthen the capability development plan. We need to improve cooperation among member states through the European Defence Agency. The security and defence cooperation in our union has to become the norm and not the exception. This is one of the core elements of our work on security and defence. We still have not explored the full potential of our treaties in this regard. The treaties give us instruments and tools to do so. We need the political, consistent will and determination to use all the instruments we have. Excuse me. Don't say that Europe is losing its voice. For instance, this is the problem, you cannot afford having a flu. For instance, the strategy calls for addressing the obstacles which have so far prevented the deployment of the battle groups, an instrument we have, an instrument that could be needed, an instrument that we might be able to use in the coming future. This is what strategic autonomy means, and this is what our union must aim at. And I would like to be completely clear on this. There is no contradiction at all between the strategic autonomy of a stronger European Union and a stronger partnership between EU and NATO. For this very reason, less than 2 weeks after the presentation of our strategy, at the NATO summit in Warsaw, we have signed a joint declaration between the EU and NATO to move our partnership to the next level. Our cooperation is getting closer and is getting wider, covering new fields from maritime security to hybrid threats, from cyber security to the fight against human smugglers at sea. And we are already working together and complementing each other in many parts of the world, from Afghanistan to the Aegean Sea. And with the joint declaration we just signed, and we're going to implement in the coming months, we have committed to an even greater cooperation, more complementarity, more coordination on exercises, a more integrated defense industry. But let me go even further than that. Not only there is no contradiction, in today's world, a strong NATO requires strong security cooperation inside the European Union. Because the only way we, the Europeans, can take responsibility for our collective security is through cooperation inside our own European Union. And the stronger European Union means a stronger NATO. And let me remind us all, especially in these hours, a strong NATO is key to America's security. We are bound to be together. And that is the history of the last 70 years across the Atlantic. And that is also the future we want for our children. Peace, security, and prosperity, both in Europe and in America. And we are bound to be together. So we must combine together our hard and soft power. We must connect our work on security and on development. We must couple conflict prevention and peacemaking. We must join our humanitarian aid and our investments for jobs and growth, our public policies and the action of private investors and civil society. This is what the strategy is about, and this will be essential to its implementation as well. 3 days ago, in the EU Foreign Affairs Council, the one where John Kerry was becoming the first Secretary of State being part of it, so coming as a guest, we have begun to work on the next steps on the implementation of the strategy. We will set a clear timetable for the strategy's implementation, and in 1 year's time, we will produce a first annual report on this. The work to revise all existing sectorial strategies and to produce new ones where needed will start already in the coming weeks and months. And we will need the whole foreign policy community to be part of this work, as you have been part of the work leading to the strategy. Your ideas have helped us through the drafting of the strategy, in the thinking, and the policy making. And they will just be as important as they have been also in the next phase. Because there is no time to lose. You know, we were discussing this just before entering the room. Some, actually many, told me that after the UK referendum, it would have been wiser to wait and postpone the presentation of the global strategy. But I thought that in difficult times, in a difficult moment for our union and for the UK, but this is a different story, our duty is to focus on what is important, on what will make our citizens safer, our region more stable, and the world a better place. Because we have a responsibility as Europeans, and we are responsible people. So I know some are tempted to demolish instead of building on what we have already achieved. But the secret of change is to focus all our energies not on fighting the old, but on building the new. So in times of turmoil and confusion, we will need, for sure, an extra dose, 2 extra doses of tenacity, rationality, which is not the most popular thing in these days, and courage. But the history of Europe has shown very well that one of the things we do better, maybe the thing we do better, apart from food, is overcoming difficulties. Is overcoming difficulties. The European Union was born on the ashes of World War II. We turned a continent that has been at war for centuries, if not for thousands of years, in the most successful project of regional integration in the entire world. And more recently, we have just come out of the worst economic crisis in our times. But we are strong. And we still have, for sure, a lot to do, a lot to improve, a lot to change. But my message here today, as it was the case in China last week, and in Europe every single day, is this. Europe is strong, and Europe will grow even stronger, together with its partners, together with America.
Well, thank you so much again for coming back to Carnegie this evening. Thanks for a very thoughtful presentation, and thanks especially for a powerful reminder of the significance of the European project, and especially the significance of transatlantic partnership as well. I know your time is limited, so what I thought I'd do is start with just 2 or 3 brief questions and then open it up to our audience. The first is quite straightforward. You mentioned that you had just finished an important ministerial meeting with John Kerry and the other members of the Counter-ISIL, Counter-Daesh coalition. And I wanted to ask, what do you think is possible as you look at Syria and Iraq, over the course of the coming year? How concerned are you that recent developments in Turkey might undermine the effectiveness or the kind of role that Turkey can play? As you look at Russia's role, do you think we're getting closer to the point of effective cooperation with Russia, or are the skeptics right, and it's going to prove impossible to persuade Russia to work toward a real political transition in Syria? So I know those are a lot of questions, but I thought I'd start with that. Yeah.
I think difficult to say if one can be optimistic or pessimistic. This is not the way I tend to approach crisis. You cannot afford being either optimistic or pessimistic. You just need to deal with what you have and try to make the most out of what you have. What we have in Syria is complicated and difficult by definition. I think the approach we took since last autumn, finally, is the right one, which means working on 3 parallel tracks where different actors have different roles and weights, and different actors and different tracks come together into a coordinated approach. It's a complex mechanism, but we have 3 elements here. We have the military component, where it is key that the US and Russia work as much as possible closely together, including military-to-military coordination, because they are the key actors on the ground that can have an impact on the cessation of hostilities. Then you have the humanitarian component, where the European Union is more a key actor. We are the first donor there. We are the only donor that is currently present with an office in Damascus, and we are the ones working hand in hand with the UN to deliver humanitarian aid. But to deliver humanitarian aid, you have to have access, and to have access, you have to have cessation of hostilities holding. But on the other side, once you have the cessation of hostilities, as it was the case in February, March for a while, if you do not have humanitarian improvements immediately, you risk undermining the whole process. And then you have the third process, that is the most important one, the political one. And here again, it's mainly, obviously for the P5, obviously for the US, but also for the European Union as such, to facilitate the different Syrian parties coming together. I see a space there. So I cannot tell you, because the European Union is not a military actor in Syria, has chosen not to be, rightly so, I think. It is not for me to say if it is likely or not that the cessation of hostilities or the military-to-military coordination between the US and Russia will work. But what I can tell you is that I see a space for humanitarian aid to effectively reach Syrians in all parts of Syria if the cessation of hostilities takes place and holds. And most of all, I see a space for the political transition. I see the determination of the Syrian opposition groups to come together and work on a transition in the immediate terms, but also a perspective for the end game of what Syria would look like at the end of the process. I'm personally convinced that a Syria that would go towards a parliamentary system would not only go back to the original institutional system that Syria was knowing before the Assad experience, but also would make the role of the president less relevant and somehow facilitate our work. But I also think that the regional actors understand now that there is no military solution to this crisis, and the only way is to find a transition that guarantees that all parts of the Syrian society find their access to power sharing and their participation in the life of the country. If we are all consistent and we stay focused, and if the military component works, which again is not in our hands, it's more in the American hands, I think that we have a space. I know that this might sound too optimistic in a moment where we see terrible news coming from the ground, but if we were to listen to the more negative approaches while we were working on the Iran deal, we would have stopped years ago. So I'm convinced that you have to keep the objective clear and try to find the entry points whenever you manage to build any. You want me to say something about Turkey immediately?
I was just going to ask, both with regard to Syria and the anti-Daesh coalition, and then just more broadly.
Well, more broadly, the European Union was the first one in that tragic night between Friday and Saturday to speak clearly on the need to protect the democratic institutions of the country. Because we know very well that Turkey and the entire region and Europe and America and the rest of the world could simply not afford turning back to last century. No change in a country can happen through a military coup. That is a basic thing. And in those hours, it was very interesting for me to see that all political forces of the country were clearly standing behind the democratic institutions. It was not something to be given for granted. This gives us a certain credibility now to say that there is no excuse for the legitimate institutions to react in a way that is not taking into consideration the rule of law, fundamental freedoms and human rights, and the right to a fair trial of all those involved. We have been very clear that any attempt to reintroduce that penalty, I know this is not necessarily the most popular argument in the United States, but the United States is not looking for a membership to the European Union yet. Reintroducing the death penalty would make it impossible for Turkey to join the European Union. This is a basic part of what we call the acquis communautaire. And, by the way, is a fundamental part of the Human Rights Convention of the Council of Europe, of which Turkey is part. So we are making it very clear to our Turkish friends. We are fully behind the institutions, the democratic institutions, the legitimate institutions, but there is no excuse, there is no way in which the reaction can undermine the fundamental freedoms and rights. And what we are seeing, especially in the field of universities, media, judiciary, is unacceptable. I've been clear enough?
That's clear. No, that's clear now. Thank you very much. Just one other question for me before I open it up to our audience, and it's on another obvious challenge in the last few weeks in Brexit and in the weeks and months and years to come. So when you began to do the global strategy, Brexit was a looming possibility. Now it's a looming reality. As you try to look
No, it's a looming possibility.
Yeah, well, well, I'd like you to explain to me how it remains a looming possibility.
It's not reality yet.
Yeah. But how do you see that affecting? I know a lot depends on, how that plays itself out, but how do you see this as affecting the strategy that you've laid out? And how significant do you think the adjustments might have to be, depending on the scenario that plays out?
We were all hoping for a different result of the referendum. My impression is that also some of those that campaigned for the Brexit might maybe have been more comfortable with different
especially those who
results.
were Googling EU on the next day. Yeah.
Anyway, we have to respect people's will. This is part of democracy. So now it's up to London to define how to turn the results of the referendum into an institutional decision. Why I'm saying it's a possibility is not because I think that there are possibilities or chances to turn back the decision. Simply, we're talking about something that will happen, the Brexit, at the end of negotiations that not only have not started yet, but have not even been requested yet. So at the moment, politically everything has changed, but institutionally and formally, the UK is a full member of the European Union and will stay a full member of the European Union for quite some time, because negotiations will take time. And again, they've not even started, they've not even been requested so far. So in this moment, the UK is a full member of the European Union. It will continue to be like this for a certain number of years. And this means that until that moment, the end of negotiations, the UK will continue to be a full part of our foreign and security policy, with its presence in our operations and missions. We have 17 of those around the world. The UK is playing a significant role in those and is not giving no signs of wanting to withdraw from that. In all our trade agreements, in all our diplomatic efforts, in our work in the UN, in the Security Council, in aid, and Boris Johnson was sitting with us for 16 hours Monday in the European Foreign Affairs Council. What will change afterwards? It will depend very much on negotiations we will have on what kind of future relationship the UK and the European Union at 27 will have. And this will be the result of internal thinking that has not really started yet, and a negotiation that is impossible to predict. I personally think that both the UK and the European Union have all the interest also in the future to continue to work as closely as possible together in foreign and security policy, because we share the same region, we live in the same continent, we have the same strategic interests. And by the way, the global strategy we're discussing is a global strategy at 28 that also the UK has welcomed. So we will see what time will bring. We will see what kind of determination will come in London. Things look still a little bit confused there, but I'm confident that the government will reflect on this and come up with some clarity. What is clear is that for sure we will continue to work in the framework of NATO, and for sure we will continue to work as neighbors. But I would like to add one thing. Many were telling me in these weeks, European Union is losing a lot in foreign policy and security policy, which is true. We lose a permanent member of the Security Council. We lose the main military actor of the European Union. We lose the main donor in terms of aid. We lose the largest, and someone would say it best, but I cannot, diplomatic network in the world. There's a couple of British diplomats here that will be happy about that. I can say for sure one of the best, after the Italian one, obviously. That's all a joke. We lose a lot. But think of what the UK lose. Because obviously the UK will, depending on what kind of arrangements we have, but the UK, I imagine, will be invited to take part to our missions and operations in the future, as it is the case for Canada or Colombia or Chile or Korea. But it will not be part anymore of the decision-making process. So it's losing the seat at the table. It's going to be an interesting conversation.
Interesting is a very diplomatic way of putting it, yeah.
I'm learning.
No, thank you very much. Let's open it up to the audience. You can just raise your hand, wait for the microphone. Amal, please, here. And just identify yourself, please, and remember to end with a question mark.
Yes, thank you. My name is Amal Mudallali with the Wilson Center. My question is concerning your talk about Syria. You said that now there's space for transition, and you said the neighbors are convinced now there is no military solution. Does this include Russia and Iran? And the other part of the question is, what levers of power the EU has to convince Assad for political transition, not militarily on the ground, and you're not involved in the process? Thank you.
Sorry. I apologize. Are all neighbors convinced? Russia and Iran, for sure, are convinced that there is no military solution to the crisis. I think that actually both might be worried that there could be an only military approach to the crisis, because they could become a trap for both of them. Some have spoken about or written about an Afghanistan for Russia, which is not the case today, but Syria is a complex place. And Russia has a Muslim population, has to deal with internally. So the risks are high. I see Russia and Iran are aware of the fact that a transition in Damascus and a political setting is the only way ahead. There might be some doubts in some other actors in the region on the effectiveness of a political solution to the crisis. My simple answer to that is that after 6 years of war, if there was, for its proper English, that's why the British diplomats are good, because they have no language problems as well as the Americans, even if the British would argue about American English. But if there was a military solution in 6 years' time, we would have had it already. Military campaign around Syria, in Syria, has been ongoing for so much time that while the political efforts is relatively new. So if someone has the illusion of winning a war after 6 years of engagement on the ground, I think it's just an illusion. The only way is really engaging on the political transition, which also will call for some compromises. I'm not among those that believe that compromises mean that there is any kind of role for Assad in the future of the country. But on the sequencing or on the timing or on the transitional arrangements, I think there will have to be some talks among the Syrians, first of all, because at the end of the day, it's their country and they will have to take responsibility jointly for their country. What kind of leverage do we have for Assad to leave? The European Union is not the first actor to have leverage on Assad. It's clearly more for Iran, Russia, to exercise some, let's say, pressure or passing some convincing arguments. It is true, though, that the European Union traditionally and even currently is one of the players in the region that has good relations to all. The European Union is not as such part of the military campaign. We, as I said, still have a technical office in Damascus delivering aid, humanitarian aid, and we still have some diplomatic channels open. We are among the few around the table having these instruments, and we might use some of these instruments at a certain moment. But again, the first step is to have a cessation of hostilities in place in the territory. Otherwise, there will be no space for political talks to start credibly, simply because it would be unsustainable for the Syrian parties to sit somewhere in Geneva while people in Syria are dying on the ground. The legitimacy, the credibility of the political talks will be completely non-credible for the Syrians. And the first thing we have to buy is the Syrian ownership of this process. I think we've learned our lessons well. Peace cannot be imposed from the top, it has to be built from the ground.
Yes, sir.
Chris Kruckenberg, Stimson Center. As you said throughout this whole session, Europe has a lot on its plate. I was wondering if you could talk about how much of a priority the TTIP negotiations with the United States is, in light of all this other stuff that you also have to deal with. Thank you.
I would be very interested in asking the same question here. It's a top priority. TTIP is a top priority. Relations with the United States in other fields apart from trade is a top priority, as I hope I clearly said. Also relations and trade relations with other partners across the Atlantic, like Canada or Mexico, are also very important for us. For two reasons. One is that we are really convinced that a trade agreement with the United States of that kind would be, given that we still have to finalize the negotiations, so cannot enter into the details, but would be extremely beneficial for our economies, both the American and the European economy. And we both need to invest in our economic growth significantly, because we're coming out of important financial and economic crisis. So we need to invest in job creation, growth, and trade. So we see the economic advantages of that, but also because, let's be clear, we are friends, we are natural friends, we are brothers and sisters. If we cannot have a trade agreement of that kind among us, with whom? It would put into question the whole trade agreement system that we are arguing for in the world. So I think that it has a more political and symbolic value that I know is questioned on both sides of the Atlantic. But I think that the combination of these two elements, the economic advantages on both sides and the political significance of strengthening the bonds among us would be extremely important. So we really hope, and we discussed this a couple of weeks ago. We had the EU-US leaders meeting in Warsaw. We were meeting with President Obama, and we restated our common commitment to try and finalize negotiations as soon as possible. I know this is controversial here. It's also controversial in Europe, but leadership is also about guiding countries through decisions that might be controversial, but we know are good for our people.
We probably have time for just a couple more questions. Just way in the back there, yes, sir.
To take a couple of questions together, so we have
Sure,
more time.
that's fine. Yeah. Yep, right there, please.
I was wondering.
Speak louder.
Yep.
Right. You mentioned that a coup cannot change a legitimate government, and I was wondering then how you see that as consistent with European arms sales to the military dictatorship in Egypt.
Didn't hear you too much.
Just repeat the last part of it.
I was wondering how the policy against coups is consistent with European policy toward the military dictatorship, specifically regarding the extensive arms sales from European countries.
Okay, that's one question. Let's take one more so we can answer them together. Yes, please.
No.
With Brexit on the horizon.
There you go. I think it's working now, yeah.
With Brexit on the horizon, do you see the EU strengthening and if so, how?
Good. On Egypt, we have a quite consistent policy. We work together on some files, for instance, on some regional issues like Middle East peace process, or on Libya, or on Syria. We have a constant work on human rights, and this is part of our daily work on the ground We support and sustain the work of human rights defenders, activists and NGOs, trade unions, media. We work very much on media freedom. And we have human rights and the role of civil society as an integral part of our high-level dialogues. I met with Minister Shukri just this morning at the margins of this ministerial today. And as you know, our security sector cooperation has been, let's say, on hold for a while. So I think this is a consistent policy. On the other side, the European way is also a way of engagement. This is also something I particularly strongly believe in. It's especially when you have problems with a partner or with an interlocutor that you need to talk. Raising walls or interrupting communication is never a good idea if you want to improve situations on the ground. Engaging, sometimes critical engagement, most of the times critical engagement, is the way in which we can, first of all, keep contact with the population, because we have a significant people-to-people exchange with Egypt in particular. For instance, think of the civil society exchanges. It's something important for keeping societies open and resilient, apart from the institutional context. So we will continue with that kind of policy. On how to, if it will be strengthened, foreign policy of the European Union, foreign security, you said, of the European Union after the perspectives of a Brexit, I think I made it quite clear, yes, it will be strengthened. And how? First of all, I think that the result of the referendum in the UK was somehow a reality check inside the European Union. While we were talking about defense issues, let me use a parallel to say it is somehow a deterrent for those in the European Union that might have thought in the past months or years that a referendum to exit the European Union would solve all problems. I think that they now see that actually London has more problems than Brussels today. So I am convinced, and by the way, in foreign policy in particular, and in security policy in particular, every single European country is a middle or small-sized country in the world. If you need to negotiate a trade agreement with China, if you need to have a military naval operation in the Mediterranean, if you need to work with countries in Africa to manage together the phenomenon of migration, and you do it as a single country of Europe, you have much less instruments than if you pull together all our instruments as Europeans. And this is why you hear so much from London, even in these days, that they want to keep the strongest possible cooperation on foreign and security policy with the European Union, even in the future, because they see very well that together we're stronger in the world. That's very simple. The bigger you are, the more instruments you have, the more, in all fields, you're more powerful and your policies are more effective. So this is also an exercise we've done with the global strategy. The starting point of this is exactly this. If we are together as Europeans, is out of a choice that our people made to join together because we knew that together we had more powerful instruments to serve our citizens' interests better. Sometimes you hear European leaders referring to transferring sovereignty to the European level, which is something unacceptable. Actually, in the world of today, you do not transfer sovereignty. You regain sovereignty if you manage to exercise sovereignty jointly at the European level. Because at the end of the day, you make decisions together. There's no one coming from the outside taking decisions. You have the 28 leaders making decisions altogether. But then you have additional instruments that make you much more powerful. So I believe that this will be the political leverage we will have to increase cooperation even more. And on the sector of defense, as I said, we have an whole set of measures that the treaties foresee that we have not used yet and that are there. So no need for treaty changes, no need for big institutional debates. I am working on the follow-up of the strategy also in the field of security and defense, putting on the table of the member states all different options for what we can already now do together to increase our instruments to guarantee security to our people. And I believe there is an interest in our people and our leaders as well to use the instruments we have already. So I think this will be the way, not a treaty change, but the full use of all the instruments that we have already and that we have not used in the past because of lack of political will. I think that it's time to invest seriously in our security, also in our security role in the world, and to use the instruments we already have to do that.
Thanks. Well, one of the worst parts of being a moderator is having to bring really interesting conversations to a close, but I did promise we'd end at 7.
But you can take one more if you
want. Okay, sure, that's fine. That's the
I
opening
enjoy.
we were looking for. So why don't we take
bonus.
Two together, I guess. Yes, ma'am. Right here, please.
Thank you very much, and High Representative Mogherini, thank you for being here. My name is Emma Louise Leahy with CNN. We're describing the 3 tracks on which actors that you identified were all international actors. Would you care to comment on what role you see for regional actors, including specifically?
One more together with that. Yes, in the back, please. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Roberta Rampton with Reuters, and I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you what your reaction is to the statements last night from the Republican presidential candidate who said that he might abandon the Article 5 commitment of NATO if elected.
I knew if we left room for enough questions, we'd get to that. Thank you very much for that.
You see, you need to take risks. I was clear enough, I think, when I said that strengthening European defense is a way of strengthening NATO, and strengthening NATO is a way of strengthening America's security. I think this is a basic evidence for all Americans. It has been so for the last 70 years. And NATO has been what has provided us, both Europeans and Americans, security for all these decades. And it's based on the principle of solidarity. So on our side, we know very well that we need to work more on our defense capabilities, on our, as I said. But on the other side, it's clear that the basic principle of an alliance is solidarity. Then I'm not NATO Secretary General. I don't vote in the US elections. It's not for me to comment on that. I have my own political ideas, but it doesn't count here. But the role of NATO and the importance of NATO and the strength and the credibility of the alliance is something that is very important for every single European citizen, and I believe also for every single American citizen, because it's very simple to realize that in the world of today, which is quite a complicated one and quite a dangerous one, you need friends. You need friends. Alone, you don't solve much. And America is lucky enough, well, has worked hard in the past to build friendships and alliances and credibility to these friendships and alliances. And this is what makes America strong, that it can count on strong partners and friends and allies to make America's security strong. So I would invest in NATO. The other question was about the Gulf countries. Yes. The role that the Gulf countries, and that they're not all the same, but in any case, that the Gulf countries in general have in our common work on Syria is key in particular because they have close relations and strong influence on the opposition in Syria. We are also working on the opposition in Syria, and with them, we hosted recently in Brussels several meetings of the Syrian opposition to prepare them for negotiations, to have a discussion also on the future of the country. The Gulf countries have a significant role in that. And yes, they are working in the same direction. They're working to prepare the opposition to talks. They also have a role on the security aspects of it. For the moment, yes, we are working well together. There's always more than one can do. But I think that there is a certain awareness of the fact that the spread of Daesh could constitute a threat also for the Gulf countries. And that is a self-interest of the Gulf countries to guarantee that the Daesh threat does not expand, and that actually it is a responsibility also of the Sunni majority countries to counter the narrative of a terrorist organization that is also playing on fake religious narrative and sectarian divisions. So we're working also on that with the Gulf countries, on trying to prevent radicalization and find the correct ways of preventing and countering radicalization narratives. And I think they have important instruments to do that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you'll join me in thanking Federica Mogherini for a really thoughtful
presentation. Thank you.